I was nobody the night he chose me, and perhaps that is why he did. In a room glittering with 7 heiresses draped in silk and diamonds, the Duke of Ravensford knelt before me, a maid with calloused hands and a borrowed dress, and offered me the ring that should have belonged to any woman but me. But I am telling this story from the wrong end, as hearts so often do when they have been shattered and remade. Let me begin where all things began for me, in the winter of 1847, when snow fell upon Thornhaven Hall like a burial shroud, and I still believed that girls like me were born only to serve, never to be seen. My name is Wren Hartley, and I was 23 years old when I learned that love does not obey the laws of men. I came to Thornhaven at 16, a scrawny girl with ink-stained fingers and a dead mother's sewing needle tucked into my sleeve for luck. My father had been a tailor of modest reputation in a village called Heathmore, and when his shop failed and his spirit followed, I was sent to the great house to earn my keep. I remember standing at the servants' entrance that first morning, my breath fogging in the December air, staring up at the grey stone walls that seemed to touch the sky itself. I thought then that I had entered a castle from a fairy story, the kind my mother used to whisper to me before the coughing took her voice forever. I did not yet know that fairy stories are full of wolves. For 7 years, I worked my way up from scullery maid to chambermaid to lady's maid, and by the winter of my 23rd year, I had become the personal attendant to Lady Gwendolen Ashworth, the Dowager Duchess of Ravensford. She was a woman carved from marble and ice, with silver hair swept back from a face that had once been beautiful and was now merely formidable. Her eyes missed nothing. Her tongue spared no one. The other servants called her the Raven behind her back, for she dressed always in black and seemed to feast upon the misfortunes of others. I called her Your Grace, and I never met her gaze unless commanded. My days at Thornhaven followed a rigid pattern that I had long since memorized. I rose before dawn each morning, lighting the fire in Lady Gwendolen's chamber before she awakened, laying out her clothes for the day, preparing her morning tray with precisely the items she required: weak tea with a single slice of lemon, 2 pieces of dry toast, a soft boiled egg. She would sit at her vanity while I brushed her hair, 100 strokes exactly, and she would list the tasks she expected me to complete before nightfall. I rarely spoke unless spoken to. I had learned early that Lady Gwendolen valued efficiency over conversation, competence over charm. But in the quiet hours of the night, when the great house slept and even the dowager's demands fell silent, I would steal moments for myself. I would light a candle in my attic room and write poems in the margins of discarded newspapers, verses about longing and loss and a world beyond these walls that I would never know. I would read books borrowed from the library, tales of adventure and romance that transported me to places where a girl like me might be something more than a pair of useful hands. These small rebellions sustained me. They reminded me that I was still alive, still human, still capable of dreaming, even if those dreams would never come true. It was on the first day of December that Lady Gwendolen told me the house would soon be filled with guests. She was seated at her vanity, and I was brushing her hair with the silver-handled brush that had belonged to her mother, when she spoke as if to the mirror rather than to me. "My son has mourned long enough," she said. 5 years is sufficient grief for any man, and the duchy cannot wait forever for an heir. I have invited 7 young ladies of excellent breeding and substantial fortune to spend the Christmas season at Thornhaven. One of them will become the next Duchess of Ravensford. I continued brushing, stroke after stroke, and said nothing. It was not my place to have opinions about the Duke or his marriage prospects. I had seen Lord Crispin Ashworth perhaps a dozen times in all my years of service, always from a distance, always in passing. He was a tall man with dark hair and darker eyes, a face that might have been handsome if it ever smiled. The other maids whispered that he had been different before his wife died, before the baby, before the light went out of him and never returned. But I had not known him then. I knew only the ghost who wandered the halls at night, the shadow who took his meals alone in the library, the master who never raised his voice because he barely spoke at all. I did not think of him as a man. I thought of him as a tragedy in a tailored coat. The tragedy was well known throughout the county, though it was spoken of only in hushed tones, as if saying the words too loudly might somehow summon the grief back into the room. Lady Philippa Ashworth had been the daughter of a viscount, a gentle creature with kind eyes and a laugh that could fill a ballroom. She and Lord Crispin had married for love, a rare enough occurrence in their circle, and for 3 years they had been blissfully happy. The entire staff had adored her. She knew every servant by name, remembered their birthdays, inquired after their families. She brought flowers to the downstairs staff on May Day and organized Christmas celebrations that included even the lowest scullery maid. I had been just 19 when she died, and though I had rarely interacted with her directly, I had grieved alongside everyone else. We all had. She was carrying the heir, the long-awaited son who would continue the Ashworth line, and the labor that should have brought joy instead brought death. The baby was stillborn, a perfect little boy with his father's dark hair, and Lady Philippa followed him within the hour. Some complication, the doctor said. Something inside her that had torn and would not stop bleeding. Lord Crispin had been at her side through all of it. He had held her hand as she pushed, had caught the baby when he emerged silent and blue, had watched as the light faded from his wife's eyes while the servants wept in the corridor outside. When it was over, he had walked out of the bedchamber, still covered in her blood, and had not spoken for 3 days. That was 5 years ago. In all that time, I had never seen him smile. I had never heard him laugh. I had never witnessed any sign that the man who had loved Lady Philippa still existed beneath the hollow shell that moved through Thornhaven like a spectre. And now Lady Gwendolen intended to remarry him, as if a heart could be repaired as easily as a torn hem. The heiresses arrived over the course of 3 days, each in her own carriage, each with her own entourage of ladies' maids and trunks and expectations. I watched them from the upstairs windows as I went about my duties. These glittering creatures who belonged to a world I could see but never enter. Lady Cordelia Pembroke came first, tall and pale, with hair the color of winter wheat and eyes as cold as the December wind. She walked as if she were already the Duchess, her chin lifted at precisely the angle that conveyed breeding without arrogance, her gloved hands folded before her with perfect composure. Her father was the Earl of Whitmore, and her dowry was rumored to be £30,000. She brought with her a lady's maid who looked at the rest of us as if we smelled of something unpleasant, and a personal secretary who carried a leather-bound book in which he recorded every detail of the estate, presumably for future reference when his mistress became its mistress. Lady Honoria Vance arrived next, and she was everything Lady Cordelia was not. Where Cordelia was cold, Honoria was fire, with auburn hair that tumbled past her shoulders in defiance of fashion and green eyes that sparkled with mischief. She laughed often and loudly, touched the footmen's arms when she spoke to them, and wore gowns cut lower than propriety strictly allowed. Her family was newly wealthy, her fortune derived from trade rather than land, and the old families looked down upon her even as they could not help but watch her. She knew the effect she had on men, and she wielded it like a weapon. I observed her at dinner on the first evening, the way she leaned close to Lord Crispin when she spoke, the way her fingers brushed against his sleeve as if by accident. He pulled away each time, his face expressionless, but she seemed undeterred. Perhaps she believed that persistence would eventually wear down his defenses. Perhaps she simply enjoyed the chase. Lady Beatrix Langley was small and soft-spoken, with brown curls and a gentle smile that seemed almost genuine. She thanked the servants who carried her bags, complimented the housekeeper on the Christmas garlands that hung from the banisters, and expressed admiration for everything from the architecture to the gardens to the quality of the tea. I wanted to like her. She seemed kind, seemed real, seemed like someone I might have been friends with in another life. But I saw the way her eyes calculated the value of every painting, every candlestick, every square foot of Thornhaven. I saw the subtle disappointment that flickered across her face when she learned that the east wing had been closed for renovations, reducing the number of rooms available for entertaining. I saw the way she studied Lady Cordelia and Lady Honoria, assessing her competition, adjusting her strategy accordingly. Her sweetness, I realized, was simply a different kind of armor. Beneath it lay an ambition as fierce as any of the others. Lady Seraphina Holt arrived in a carriage trimmed with gold, and from the moment she stepped onto the gravel drive, I knew she would be the most dangerous of them all. She was beautiful in the way that winter is beautiful, sharp and bright and capable of killing. Her hair was black as a raven's wing, her eyes the pale blue of a frozen lake, her features so perfect they might have been carved from alabaster. She moved with the grace of a cat, every gesture deliberate, every word measured. She spoke to her lady's maid as if the girl were a dog, snapping commands and criticizing everything from the way her gowns had been packed to the arrangement of her hair. When a footman stumbled while carrying her trunk, she demanded that he be dismissed on the spot, her voice cold with contempt. Lady Gwendolen, watching from the doorway, simply smiled. I saw something pass between them, some recognition of kindred spirits, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. Lady Seraphina would be the dowager's champion, I realized. She was everything Lady Gwendolen admired. Beautiful, ruthless, utterly devoid of sentiment. If the Duke chose her, she would rule Thornhaven with an iron hand, and the servants would learn to fear her just as we had learned to fear his mother. Lady Imogen Fairchild was perhaps 18, barely more than a girl, with wide brown eyes and a nervous habit of twisting her gloves in her hands. She came with her mother, a hawk-faced woman named Mrs. Fairchild, who answered questions that had been directed at her daughter and steered Imogen through the halls as if she were a puppet on strings. I felt sorry for Lady Imogen. She looked at Thornhaven not with ambition, but with terror. She looked at Lord Crispin not with desire, but with dread. She was here because her mother had brought her, because she had no choice, because the wishes of daughters mattered little when fortunes and futures were at stake. I wanted to tell her to run. I wanted to tell her that marriage to a man who still loved his dead wife would be a prison from which there was no escape. But of course I said nothing. It was not my place. Lady Octavia Sterling was a widow of 26, elegant and reserved, with auburn hair swept into a perfect chignon and eyes that had seen too much of life's cruelties to be surprised by anything. Her first husband had been a viscount who died of fever within a year of their marriage, leaving her with a modest fortune and a reputation for being unlucky. Some whispered that she had poisoned him. Others whispered that she had driven him to despair. But most believed the simplest explanation, that life had been unkind to her, as it was unkind to so many women who had no control over their own fates. She came to Thornhaven not for love, I suspected, but for security. The modest fortune her husband had left would not last forever. Her family was of good lineage, but little wealth. A second marriage to a duke would ensure that she never again had to worry about her future. I could not blame her for that. I understood what it meant to be at the mercy of circumstance, to grasp at any opportunity that might lift you out of the precarious existence you had been dealt. And finally, on the third day, came Lady Clarissa Beaumont. She was the one Lady Gwendolen spoke of most often, the one the dowager had chosen before the others even arrived. Lady Clarissa was the niece of the Earl of Pemberton, a man whose political influence stretched to the highest levels of Parliament, and her dowry was whispered to be £50,000 or more. She was beautiful in a classical way, with golden hair and blue eyes and skin like porcelain, features so symmetrical they might have been designed by an artist. She played the pianoforte divinely. She spoke French and Italian and a little German. She had been presented at court and had danced with a prince. She had been trained from birth to be a duchess, and she carried herself with the absolute certainty of someone who had never doubted her own worth. She was, in short, perfect. I hated her on sight, though I could not have explained why. Perhaps it was the way she looked through me as if I were made of glass. Perhaps it was the way she smiled at Lady Gwendolen with such calculated warmth, already claiming her place as the favored daughter-in-law. Perhaps it was simply that she had everything I would never have, and she wore it as carelessly as a borrowed shawl. But I was a servant, and servants do not hate. Servants do not feel. Servants exist only to make the lives of their betters more comfortable. And so I pressed my feelings down into the dark place where I kept all the things I was not permitted to want, and I went about my work. The first week of December passed in a blur of preparations and festivities. The great hall was decorated with holly and ivy, with red ribbons and golden candles, with a Christmas tree that reached nearly to the ceiling and was hung with ornaments that had been in the Ashworth family for generations. The kitchens worked around the clock, producing feast after feast for the guests who gathered each evening in the dining room. There were card parties and musicales, ice skating on the frozen lake, and rides through the snow-covered grounds in carriages lined with fur. I observed it all from the periphery, moving through the margins of their world like a shadow. I carried trays and delivered messages and laid out gowns for Lady Gwendolen, who seemed to grow more animated with each passing day, more invested in the spectacle she had orchestrated. She watched the heiresses with the sharp eye of a general assessing troops, noting their strategies, evaluating their chances, adjusting her own plans accordingly. Lady Clarissa remained her clear favorite. She made no secret of it, praising Lady Clarissa's accomplishments at every opportunity, seating her at Lord Crispin's right hand at dinner, arranging for private conversations between them in the drawing-room. But the Duke seemed impervious to her machinations. He was polite to Lady Clarissa, as he was polite to all the heiresses, but there was no warmth in his voice, no light in his eyes. He looked at her the way one might look at a piece of furniture, acknowledging its presence without being moved by it. Lady Cordelia attempted to engage him in discussions of politics and estate management, topics she had clearly studied in preparation for this visit. She spoke knowledgeably about crop rotation and tenant relations, about the reform bills being debated in Parliament and the challenges facing the landed gentry in an age of industrialization. Lord Crispin nodded along politely, occasionally offering a brief response, but I could see that his mind was elsewhere. He answered her questions without interest, excused himself from their conversations as early as propriety allowed. Lady Honoria took a different approach. She flirted openly, laughing at his every word, finding excuses to touch his arm or lean close enough that he could smell her perfume. She wore gowns that displayed her figure to advantage and spoke of her love for adventure, for risk, for experiences that other women might find too bold. But her advances only seemed to make him withdraw further. He stepped back when she stepped forward, maintained a careful distance that she could not close no matter how hard she tried. Lady Beatrix offered sympathy and understanding, speaking softly of loss and grief and the difficulty of moving forward after tragedy. She mentioned her own deceased grandmother with tears in her eyes, described the months of mourning that had followed, expressed her belief that time eventually healed all wounds. Lord Crispin listened to her with what might have been appreciation, but I noticed that he never shared his own feelings in return. He accepted her compassion without reciprocating, kept his grief locked away where no one could reach it. Lady Seraphina cultivated Lady Gwendolen rather than the Duke himself, correctly surmising that the path to Thornhaven ran through the Dowager. She complimented the decorations, praised the organization of the household, expressed admiration for the way Lady Gwendolen had maintained the family's position during the difficult years of her son's mourning. The Dowager preened under this attention, clearly pleased to have found an heiress who recognized her importance. But I saw the way Lady Seraphina's eyes flickered to Lord Crispin when she thought no one was watching, the calculation behind her deference to his mother. Lady Imogen barely spoke at all, hovering at the edges of gatherings while her mother answered questions on her behalf. Mrs. Fairchild pushed her daughter forward at every opportunity, arranging for her to sit near the Duke at dinner, suggesting that she play the pianoforte for the company's entertainment. But Imogen's playing was mediocre at best, her conversation stilted and nervous, and Lord Crispin barely seemed to register her presence. Lady Octavia observed more than she participated, watching the other heiresses with cool appraisal, biding her time. She was the oldest of the candidates, the most experienced, and she seemed to understand that this contest would not be won through aggressive pursuit. She maintained a dignified reserve, engaging Lord Crispin in quiet conversations when the opportunity arose, offering neither sympathy nor seduction, but simply intelligent companionship. Of all the heiresses, I thought she might have the best chance. She was the only one who seemed to see him as a person rather than a prize. And through it all, Lord Crispin Ashworth watched from the edges, a spectre at his own courtship. I studied him when I could, stealing glances when I delivered Lady Gwendolyn's tea or passed through the halls on my errands. I noticed the shadows under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. I noticed the way his hand sometimes moved to his breast pocket, where I suspected he kept some memento of his lost wife. I noticed the way he looked at the Christmas tree, at the ornaments that must have held memories of holidays past, with an expression of such profound sorrow that I had to look away. He was a man trapped in amber, frozen in the moment of his greatest loss, unable to move forward, no matter how desperately his mother pushed. I understood that feeling. I understood what it was to lose someone and feel as if part of yourself had died with them. My mother had been gone for 11 years, and still there were moments when I forgot she was dead, when I turned to share something with her and remembered all over again that she was not there. The grief never fully disappeared. It simply became a part of you, woven into the fabric of who you were, present even in the moments of greatest joy. Perhaps that was why I felt such unexpected kinship with this man I barely knew. Perhaps that was why, despite all the reasons I had to keep my distance, I found myself thinking about him more and more as the days passed. It was a dangerous indulgence, and I knew it. But the heart, as I was learning, does not respond to warnings. It was on the 10th of December that everything changed. A storm had been building all day, clouds the color of bruises gathering over the moors, and by evening the snow was falling so thickly that the windows were nearly obscured. The wind howled around the corners of the house like a living thing, rattling the shutters and moaning through the chimneys. The guests had retired early, driven to their rooms by the cold that seeped through even the thickest walls, and the house fell into an uneasy quiet. Lady Gwendolyn had dismissed me after supper, complaining of a headache that she blamed on the change in weather. I should have gone to the servants' hall, where the other maids were gathered around the fire, sharing gossip and warming their hands. I should have gone to my attic room to sleep, knowing that morning would come early and the work would begin again. Instead, I found my feet carrying me to the library. It was my secret indulgence, my one rebellion against the life I had been given. The library at Thornhaven was vast, 2 stories of leather-bound volumes stretching from floor to ceiling, with ladders on brass rails and reading chairs upholstered in wine-colored velvet. The smell of old paper and leather polish filled the air, mingling with the faint scent of wood smoke from the great fireplace. I had discovered years ago that no one came here after dark. The family preferred the drawing room, the guests preferred their own company, and the servants were too exhausted by the end of the day to think of books. And so, on nights when the weight of my existence became too heavy to bear, I would slip into the library and lose myself in worlds where a girl like me might be something more. I had read my way through the novels of Miss Austen, the poetry of Lord Byron, the plays of Shakespeare. I had traveled to distant lands and fallen in love with fictional heroes and lived 1,000 lives that would never be mine. The library was my sanctuary, the only place in Thornhaven where I felt truly free. That night, I did not notice the fire burning low in the grate. I did not notice the empty brandy decanter on the side table. I did not notice, until I was already inside with the door closed behind me, that I was not alone. Lord Crispin Ashworth sat in the chair nearest the fire, his cravat undone, his coat discarded, his dark hair falling across a face that was ravaged by drink and grief. He was slumped in the chair as if his bones could no longer support his weight, and in his hands He held something small, something that gleamed white in the dying firelight. A baby's shoe. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to flee. A servant caught alone with the Duke, late at night, in an empty room. This was the kind of scandal that ended in dismissal without references, in ruin, in a life on the streets. I should have turned and run. I should have pretended I had never seen him. But he looked up, and his eyes met mine, and I could not move. They were not the eyes of a duke. They were the eyes of a man who had been drowning for 5 years and had finally stopped fighting the current. They were red-rimmed and hollow, filled with a pain so vast that it seemed to swallow the room. I had seen grief before. I had lived with it, breathed it, carried it like a stone in my chest. But I had never seen grief like this. Grief that had become a person's entire existence, that had consumed everything else until there was nothing left. "Come to steal a book, have you?" he asked, and his voice was rough, slurred with brandy but not unkind. "Aye, Your Grace. I am so sorry. I will leave at once." "No." He held up a hand, and I stopped. "Stay. I am tired of being alone with the dead." I did not know what to say. I did not know what to do. I stood there like a fool, my heart pounding so loudly that I was certain he could hear it, while the storm raged outside and the fire crackled, and the Duke of Ravensford looked at me as if I were the first living thing he had seen in years. "You work for my mother," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, Your Grace. I am Wren Hartley, your mother's lady's maid. Wren." He repeated the name as if tasting it. "Like the bird, small and brown and easily overlooked. Yes, Your Grace." He laughed then, a sound that held no humor, only exhaustion. "Do you know, Miss Hartley, that you are the first person in this house who has not tried to convince me to marry one of those women downstairs?" I did not know what to say to that either, so I remained silent. He turned back to the fire, the baby shoe still cradled in his hands. It was so small, I thought, impossibly small. How could something so tiny have meant so much? How could a life that never even began have left such a vast emptiness in its wake? "He was meant to be called Edward," Lord Crispin said softly. "After my father. He would be 5 years old now if he had lived. He would be learning to ride, learning to read, asking me questions I could not answer." He paused, and I saw his throat work as he swallowed. I imagine him sometimes, standing by the window, watching for my carriage when I return from London, running to meet me at the door, calling me Papa. The pain in his voice was almost unbearable. I felt it like a physical thing, a weight pressing against my chest, making it hard to breathe. "And Philippa," he continued, still staring into the flames. "She smiled at me. At the end. She was dying, and she knew it, and she smiled at me, and told me it would be all right. Told me to be happy, told me to live. And then she was gone, and I—" He broke off, his voice cracking, and pressed the little shoe to his forehead as if in prayer. I should have left. I should have excused myself, fled to the safety of the servants' quarters, forgotten this night had ever happened. But something in his voice held me there, some thread of anguish that resonated with my own buried grief, and instead of leaving, I did something I had never done in 7 years of service. I spoke. "My mother died when I was 12, I said. Consumption. She coughed for months before the end, and I would lie awake at night listening to it, counting the seconds between each breath, praying for them to continue and dreading them at the same time. When she finally stopped, I did not cry. I could not cry. I felt as if I had turned to stone, as if all the tears inside me had frozen solid. It was years before I thawed. He looked at me again, and this time there was something different in his gaze, something like recognition, something like understanding. "And did you?" he asked. "Thaw?" I thought of my mother's sewing needle, still tucked into my sleeve after all these years. I thought of the poems I wrote in secret, The words I poured out onto paper because I could not speak them aloud. I thought of the books I read by candlelight, the worlds I escaped into, the dreams I would not allow myself to dream, because dreams were for people with futures. Slowly, I said, and not completely, but enough. The silence stretched between us, but it was not uncomfortable. The fire crackled, filling the room with warmth and dancing shadows. The wind howled outside, but inside this cocoon of books and firelight, we were safe, sheltered. For a moment, just a moment, I was not a servant, and he was not a duke. We were simply two wounded creatures sharing the same darkness. "You are the first person who has not told me that time heals all wounds," he said quietly. "The first person who has not promised that the pain will fade, that I will love again, that life goes on. Everyone says those things, and they mean well, but they do not understand. They cannot understand." "I understand," I said, and I meant it. He nodded, and something in his expression shifted, as if he had been holding his breath for 5 years and had finally exhaled. "You should go," he said at last. "It would not do for you to be found here." "No," I agreed, "it would not." But neither of us moved. That was the beginning. In the days that followed, I found myself thinking of him constantly. I went about my duties as I always had, brushing Lady Gwendolyn's hair, laying out her clothes, attending to her endless demands, but my mind was elsewhere. I thought of the way his voice had cracked when he spoke his son's name. I thought of the way he had looked at me, not through me, but at me, as if I were a person and not a piece of furniture. I thought of the way my own voice had sounded when I told him about my mother, the first time I had spoken of her death to anyone in 11 years. I told myself it meant nothing, a moment of shared grief, quickly forgotten. He was a duke, and I was a maid, and the chasm between us was wider than the English Channel. But at night, in my narrow bed, I found myself replaying our conversation over and over, searching for meanings that were not there. I did not see him for 3 days after that night. The storm passed, the sun emerged, and the household resumed its normal rhythms of festivity and competition. The heiresses continued their campaign, each one convinced that she alone could thaw the frozen heart of the Duke of Ravensford. Lady Cordelia organized a tour of the estate, demonstrating her knowledge of agricultural management. Lady Honoria arranged a riding expedition, showing off her skill in the saddle. Lady Clarissa played a concert in the music room, her fingers dancing across the keys with technical perfection. And Lord Crispin watched it all with the same flat, distant expression he had worn since his wife's death. He applauded when applause was expected, offered compliments when compliments were required, but his eyes remained empty. He was going through the motions, performing the role his mother had assigned him, without any genuine engagement with the women who were competing for his hand. I began to feel something I had never felt before, something hot and bitter that sat in my chest like a stone. Jealousy. I had no right to it. I had no claim on Lord Crispin Ashworth, no reason to resent these women who belonged in his world while I belonged in the shadows. But every time I saw Lady Clarissa place her hand on his arm, every time I heard Lady Honoria's tinkling laugh echo through the halls, every time Lady Seraphina spoke of becoming the next Duchess of Ravensford, I felt that stone grow heavier. It was wrong, it was foolish, it was dangerous, and I could not stop it. On the 13th of December, Lady Gwendolyn sent me to the village to fetch a package from the dressmaker. The storm had passed, leaving the world blanketed in pristine white, and I was grateful for the excuse to escape the house. I borrowed a cloak from the servants' stores and set out on foot, following the path that wound through the estate and down to the village of Heathmoor. It was a walk of perhaps 2 miles, and I savored every step. The cold air was sharp in my lungs, the snow crunching beneath my boots, the pale winter sun filtering through bare branches. The world was silent, except for the occasional call of a bird, the distant bark of a dog, the soft whisper of wind through the naked trees. For a few hours, I was free. Not a servant, not a maid, just a woman walking through a world made new by snow. The village was quiet when I arrived, most of the inhabitants staying indoors to avoid the cold. I retrieved the package from Mrs. Thornton, the dressmaker, a length of pale blue silk that Lady Gwendolen had ordered for a Christmas gown. Mrs. Thornton was a kind woman who had known my mother, and she insisted on giving me a cup of tea and a slice of cake before I set off on my return journey. I was perhaps halfway home, the package tucked under my arm, when I heard the sound of hoofbeats behind me. I stepped off the path, expecting a carriage or a rider from the estate, and turned to see Lord Crispin Ashworth astride a black horse, his breath misting in the cold air, his dark eyes fixed on me. "Miss Hartley," he said, and my name in his mouth did something strange to my heart. "You should not be walking alone in this weather." "I have walked this path many times, Your Grace," I said, keeping my eyes lowered. "I am quite safe." He dismounted, landing in the snow with the grace of a man who had been riding since childhood. The horse snorted and stamped, its breath pluming in the frigid air. Lord Crispin patted its neck absently, then turned to face me. "Nevertheless, I will accompany you back to the house." My mother would never forgive me if her lady's maid caught a chill. It was a thin excuse, and we both knew it. But I did not argue. I could not argue. Every rule of service, every instinct of self-preservation told me to refuse, to insist that he ride on ahead while I walked behind, to maintain the distance that was supposed to exist between us. Instead, I fell into step beside him as he led his horse by the reins, and we walked together through the frozen world. The silence stretched between us, comfortable despite its impropriety. I watched my breath fog in the cold air, watched the snow glitter in the pale sunlight, watched anything except the man beside me. If I looked at him, I was afraid of what I might reveal. "You have been avoiding me," he said after a while. "I have been performing my duties, Your Grace," I said carefully. "Nothing more." "Liar." The word was soft, almost affectionate, and I felt the heat rise to my cheeks despite the cold. "I mean no disrespect," he continued, "but you are avoiding me. I have seen you turn and walk the other way when you see me coming. I have noticed that you suddenly find tasks in the opposite wing of the house whenever I am near. You are not as subtle as you think, Miss Hartley." I did not know what to say. He was right, of course. I had been avoiding him, terrified of my own feelings, terrified of what might happen if I allowed myself to be alone with him again. "I am trying to protect us both," I said at last. "Whatever you think is happening here, it cannot happen. You are a duke, and I am a servant. The world does not permit such things." "The world," he said, his voice suddenly bitter, "does not permit a man to grieve his wife for more than a year without being paraded before a succession of heiresses like a prize bull at auction. The world does not permit a man to choose his own heart. The world does not permit happiness that has not been sanctioned by society and blessed by fortune. The world permits nothing that matters." I stopped walking, and he stopped with me. We stood in the middle of the snow-covered path, the horse snorting softly beside us, the silence of the winter woods pressing in around us. "What do you want from me?" I asked, and my voice was barely a whisper. He was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes searching my face as if looking for something he had lost. Then he said, "I want you to look at me." I raised my eyes to his, and what I saw there made my breath catch in my throat. It was not desire, or at least not only desire. It was hunger, the hunger of a man who had been starving for years and had finally found something that might sustain him. It was hope, fragile and terrified, reaching out despite all the reasons it should stay hidden. "I do not know what is happening to me," he said. "I have spent 5 years feeling nothing, wanting nothing, and then you walked into that library and I felt—" He broke off, shaking his head. I felt something, for the first time since Philippa died. I felt alive. "Your Grace," I began. "Crispin," he said. "When we are alone, please, call me Crispin." I could not. It was too intimate, too dangerous. But the word formed on my lips anyway, unbidden. Impossible. Crispin. He smiled then, a real smile, the first I had ever seen on his face. It transformed him. The shadows lifted from his eyes. The lines of grief softened, and I glimpsed the man he must have been before tragedy had hollowed him out. He was handsome, I realized. Genuinely handsome, not just in the way of all wealthy men, but in a way that made my heart ache. "There," he said softly. "That was not so difficult, was it?" "It was the most difficult thing I have ever done," I admitted. He laughed, and the sound was so unexpected, so genuine, that I laughed too. And standing there in the snow, laughing with the Duke of Ravensford as if we were equals, as if the world made sense, I felt the walls I had built around my heart begin to crack. "We should go back," I said, when the laughter faded. "Before we are missed." "Yes," he agreed, "we should." But neither of us moved. And when he reached out and took my hand, his glove warm against my frozen fingers, I did not pull away. We walked the rest of the way in silence, hand in hand, his horse trailing behind us. At the edge of the estate, where the path emerged from the woods and the house became visible in the distance, we stopped. He released my hand, and the loss of his touch was almost painful. "I will see you tonight," he said. "In the library, after the household has retired." It was not a question. "Yes," I said. "You will." That night, and every night for the next week, I slipped away from my room after the other maids were asleep and made my way to the library. And every night he was there, waiting for me. We talked for hours, curled in the chairs by the fire, our voices low so as not to be heard. He told me about his childhood, about the father he had worshipped, and the mother who had always demanded more than he could give. He told me about Cambridge, where he had studied literature and dreamed of being a poet before duty called him home. He told me about the pressure he had felt to marry well, to produce an heir, to continue the Ashworth line. He told me about Philippa, whom he had loved with the innocent certainty of youth, and whose death had shattered something inside him that he had thought would never heal. And I told him about myself, about my mother's illness and my father's failures, about the years of servitude, the loneliness, the constant sense of being invisible, about the books that had been my only escape, the words that had saved me when nothing else could, about the poems I wrote in the margins of discarded newspapers, the stories I told myself at night to keep the despair at bay. He asked to read my poems, and I refused, flustered and embarrassed. "They are nothing," I said, "scribblings, not fit for anyone's eyes but my own." He did not press, but I saw the curiosity in his expression, and I knew that someday, if there was a someday, I would show him everything. Those nights in the library became the center of my existence. During the day, I performed my duties as I always had, but my mind was elsewhere. I counted the hours until darkness fell, until the house grew quiet, until I could slip away to the one place where I felt truly alive. I knew it was dangerous. I knew it was foolish. I knew that if we were discovered, I would lose everything I had worked for. But I could not stop. I could not stay away. And neither, it seemed, could he. It was on the 7th night that he kissed me. We had been talking about poetry, about Wordsworth and Keats and the Romantics who believed that feeling was the highest form of truth. He was reciting a passage from memory, his voice low and musical, when he stopped mid-line and looked at me with an expression I could not read. "What is it?" I asked. "You are so beautiful," he said, and the words seemed to surprise him as much as they surprised me. "Not beautiful like them?" he added quickly, "not polished or practiced or arranged for display. Beautiful like the dawn, beautiful like the first snowfall of winter, beautiful in a way that makes me want to be a better man, just so I might be worthy of looking at you. I could not speak. I could not move. I could only sit there as he rose from his chair, crossed the space between us, and knelt before me as if I were the Duchess and he the supplicant. "Tell me to stop," he whispered, his face inches from mine. "Tell me this is wrong, and I will walk away and never speak of it again. But if there is any part of you that feels what I feel." I kissed him. It was impulsive and clumsy, born of years of longing and weeks of restraint. I had never kissed a man before, and I am certain I did it badly. My lips pressed against his too hard. My hands gripped his shoulders too tightly. My heart pounded so loudly that I was certain he could feel it through my clothes. But then his arms came around me, and his lips moved against mine, and something inside me broke open. I felt as if I had been holding my breath for my entire life and was finally allowed to exhale. The walls I had built came crashing down. The grief I had carried for 11 years loosened its grip, and in its place was something new, something terrifying and wonderful and impossible to name. When we finally broke apart, we were both trembling. "This changes nothing," I said, though my voice shook, "and it changes everything." "I know," he said. "I know." But knowing did not stop us. Nothing could stop us now. The days leading up to Christmas passed in a haze of stolen moments and hidden glances. We met in the library every night, and sometimes during the day we would find excuses to cross paths, a brush of fingers in a doorway, a shared smile across a crowded room. It was reckless, and it was foolish, and it was the most alive I had ever felt. But we were not as careful as we thought. Lady Seraphina Holt had noticed. I did not know it at first. I did not know that she had seen me slipping out of my room one night and had followed me through the darkened halls, moving silently in her silk slippers, her pale eyes gleaming with suspicion. I did not know that she had pressed her ear to the library door and heard enough to piece together the truth. I did not know until the morning of December 23rd, when she cornered me in the linen closet and made her intentions clear. "You little whore," she hissed, her beautiful face twisted with rage. "Did you think no one would notice? Did you think you could steal what belongs to your betters?" "I do not know what you are speaking of, my lady," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "Do not lie to me." She stepped closer, and I could smell her perfume, cloying and expensive, mixed with the sharp scent of fury. "I saw you go to the library. I heard you with him, laughing, talking, and more besides, I would wager." My blood ran cold, but I held her gaze. "I have done nothing wrong." "Nothing wrong?" She laughed, a sharp, cruel sound that echoed off the whitewashed walls. "You have seduced a duke, you common little slut. You have made yourself a whore for a title you will never have. And when I tell the Dowager Duchess what her precious lady's maid has been doing with her son—" She let the threat hang in the air, savoring my fear like fine wine. "Please," I whispered, and I hated myself for begging, "please do not. Why should I spare you?" She tilted her head, studying me as if I were an insect she was deciding whether to crush. "You have nothing to offer me. You are nothing, a servant, a nobody, and yet you dared to reach above your station, to put your filthy hands on a man who should be mine." I could not speak. The walls of the linen closet seemed to close in around me, the smell of lavender and starch suddenly suffocating. I thought of everything I had built, 7 years of careful work, of earning my place, of surviving. All of it could be destroyed with a few well-chosen words. Lady Seraphina smiled, and it was the smile of a cat with a mouse between its paws. "I will make you a bargain," she said. "Leave Thornhaven tonight. Disappear without a word. If you do, I will keep your secret. But if you are still here tomorrow, I will tell the Dowager everything. I will make sure you are thrown out without references, without a penny, with your reputation in tatters. You will never work in a respectable house again. You will have nothing. Do you understand?" I understood. I understood that she was giving me a chance to save myself, to escape with at least some shred of dignity intact. I understood that if I stayed, I would lose everything. But I also understood that if I left, I would lose him. "I need time to consider," I said, the words barely audible. "You have until midnight," Lady Seraphina said. And then she swept out of the linen closet, leaving me alone with my terror and my impossible choice. I spent the rest of the day in a fog, performing my duties mechanically, avoiding Crispin whenever I could. I could not tell him what had happened. I could not bear to see the pain in his eyes, the guilt that would follow him if he knew that his feelings for me had put my livelihood, my very survival, at risk. That evening, the household gathered in the great hall for a Christmas Eve celebration. There was music and laughter, mulled wine and mince pies, games and merriment that seemed to mock my despair. The 7 heiresses circled Crispin like sharks scenting blood, and I watched from the shadows, wondering if by this time tomorrow I would be gone. But as the hours ticked by, as midnight approached and the moment of decision drew near, I found that I could not do it. I could not leave him. I could not walk away from the only person who had ever seen me, truly seen me, without even saying goodbye. At 11 o'clock, I slipped away from the servants' hall and made my way to the library for what I believed would be the last time. He was waiting for me, as he always was, standing by the fire with a glass of brandy in his hand. But when he saw my face, his smile faded. "What is it?" he asked, setting down the glass and crossing to me. "What has happened?" And I told him. Everything. Lady Seraphina's discovery, her threats, her ultimatum, my fear of what would happen to me if I stayed. When I finished, his face was pale with fury. "I will speak to her," he said. "I will make her understand that." "You will make her understand what?" I interrupted, my voice breaking. "That you love a servant? That you intend to marry beneath you? Even if you could convince her to keep silent, there would be others. Your mother, the other heiresses, society itself. They will never accept me, Crispin. They will never let us be together. Then we will leave," he said fiercely. "We will go somewhere no one knows us, somewhere the rules do not apply, America, Australia, anywhere, and abandon your duty, your title, your responsibilities." He was silent for a long moment, his jaw tight, his eyes blazing with frustration. Then he said quietly, "Yes, if that is what it takes." I stared at him, unable to believe what I was hearing. He meant it. He would give up everything, his fortune, his position, his family, his birthright, for me. And I loved him all the more for it, but I could not let him do it. "No," I said, and the word felt like a knife in my own heart. "I will not let you throw away your life for me. I am not worth it." "You are worth everything," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You are worth more than all of this, more than the title, more than the estate, more than 100 fortunes. You are the only real thing in my life, Wren, the only thing that matters." I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. "You say that now, but someday you would resent me. Someday you would look at everything you lost and wonder if I was worth the price. Someday the love would turn to bitterness, and I could not bear that. I could not bear to watch you hate me. Never," he said. "Always," I whispered. "That is how these stories end, with regret, with bitterness, with love turned to ash." He crossed the space between us and took my face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away my tears. His eyes burned into mine with an intensity that took my breath away. "Then we will write a different story," he said. "One where love wins. One where the ending is not tragedy, but triumph. I have spent 5 years trapped in a story written by grief. Let me write a new one. Let me write it with you." And before I could argue, before I could tell him all the reasons why this was impossible, he kissed me again. His lips were warm against mine, his hands gentle on my face, and I forgot everything except the taste of him, the feel of him, the impossible, undeniable truth that I loved him and he loved me, and the world was about to demand a price for our transgression. It was then that the door burst open. Lady Gwendolen stood in the doorway, her face a mask of horror and rage. Behind her, Lady Seraphina smiled with vicious triumph, and beside them stood several of the other heiresses, their expressions ranging from shock to disgust. "So it is true," the dowager said, her voice like ice. "My son, with a servant." Crispin stepped in front of me, shielding me with his body. "Mother, do not speak to me." Lady Gwendolen's eyes blazed with fury. "Do not dare to speak to me. I have given you everything, sacrificed everything, and this is how you repay me. With this?" She gestured at me as if I were a pile of refuse. "I love her," Crispin said simply. The words hung in the air, terrible and beautiful and true. I heard gasps from the heiresses, saw Lady Clarissa press her hand to her mouth in disbelief, watched Lady Seraphina's triumphant smile falter slightly, as if she had not expected such a direct declaration. "Love?" Lady Gwendolen laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You loved Philippa, and look what came of that. Death. Grief. 5 years of mourning that have made you the laughingstock of society. And now you claim to love this nothing?" "She is not nothing," Crispin said, his voice hardening. "She is more than any of those women you have paraded before me. She is real. She is true. She sees me as a man, not as a title. She knows my grief and does not try to cure it. She knows my pain and does not look away. And if you cannot accept that, then you are no mother of mine." I had never heard him speak to her like that. Neither, it seemed, had Lady Gwendolen. For a moment, something flickered across her face, something that might have been hurt or surprise, or even, perhaps, respect. But then it was gone, replaced by cold determination. "This conversation is over," she said. "Tomorrow evening, at the Christmas ball, you will announce your engagement to Lady Clarissa Beaumont. That girl," she pointed at me, "will be gone by morning, and we will never speak of this again." "No," Crispin said. It was not a shout. It was not a plea. It was a simple, quiet refusal, and it stopped Lady Gwendolen in her tracks. "What did you say?" "I said no." Crispin's voice was calm now, steady. "I will not marry Lady Clarissa. I will not marry any of them. And if you try to send Wren away, I will leave with her. You would not dare. Watch me." They stared at each other, mother and son, locked in a battle of wills that I sensed had been building for years. The air crackled with tension. The heiresses watched in stunned silence. And then, to my astonishment, Lady Gwendolen looked away first. "We will discuss this in the morning," she said, her voice suddenly weary. "When you are sober, when you have come to your senses." "My senses have never been clearer," Crispin said. "But yes, we will discuss it in the morning." Lady Gwendolen turned and swept out of the room. Lady Seraphina followed, casting one last venomous glance in my direction. The other heiresses trailed behind, whispering among themselves. And then there was silence. "I should go," I said, my voice trembling, "before she changes her mind and has me thrown out tonight." "You are not going anywhere," Crispin said. He took my hand, held it tightly. "We will face this together." "How?" I asked. "How can we possibly?" "I do not know," he admitted, "but we will find a way. I promise you, Wren. I will not let you go." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that love could conquer the rigid hierarchies of English society, that a duke could marry a maid and live happily ever after, that fairy tales could come true even for girls like me. But I had learned long ago that fairy tales were full of wolves. That night, I did not return to my room in the servants' quarters. Crispin insisted that I stay in one of the guest chambers, a room as large as the entire house where I had grown up, with a fire burning in the grate and a bed so soft I might have been sleeping on clouds. I lay awake until dawn, staring at the painted ceiling, wondering what the morning would bring. I did not have to wonder long. The summons came at 8 o'clock, delivered by a footman whose face was carefully blank. Lady Gwendolen wished to see me in her private sitting room, immediately. I dressed quickly, not in my maid's uniform, but in a plain dress that I had brought from home years ago and kept for Sundays. If I was to be dismissed, I would face it as myself, not as a servant. Lady Gwendolen was waiting for me, seated in a high-backed chair by the window. The morning light was cruel to her, revealing every line and shadow on her face, and for the first time I saw her not as a fearsome matriarch, but as an old woman, tired and afraid. "Sit," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. I sat. For a long moment, she simply looked at me, her gray eyes searching my face for something I could not identify. "My son tells me he intends to marry you," she said at last. "He tells me he will renounce his title if necessary, abandon his duties, forsake his family name, all for a girl who was cleaning his chambers a week ago." I said nothing. There was nothing to say. "Do you love him?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "I love him. And do you understand what you would be asking him to give up? The estate, the fortune, the position in society, the respect of his peers, the future of the Ashworth line?" "I understand," I said. "Which is why I have told him he should not do it." Lady Gwendolen's eyes narrowed. "You have told him?" "Yes." I met her gaze directly, no longer afraid. "I love your son, Lady Gwendolen. I love him enough to want what is best for him, even if that means losing him. I will not let him destroy his life for me. If you are here to offer me money to leave, save your breath. I will go willingly. I will disappear, and he will never find me, and in time he will forget me and marry someone appropriate and carry on the Ashworth name as he was born to do." The dowager stared at me as if I had grown a second head. "You would do that," she said slowly. "You would walk away. For him, I confirmed. For his future, for his happiness, even though it would break your heart." I smiled then, a sad, tired smile. "My heart has been broken before, Lady Gwendolen. It heals, eventually. It always heals." She was silent for a long time. Outside, I could hear the sounds of the house awakening, servants moving through the halls, the distant clatter of breakfast being prepared in the kitchens. The world was going on as it always did, indifferent to the small human dramas playing out within its walls. When Lady Gwendolen finally spoke, her voice was different, softer, almost kind. "I have been wrong about many things," she said, "about Crispin. About what he needs. About what I thought I knew of love and duty and sacrifice." She paused, and I saw something glisten in her eyes. Tears. I had never imagined Lady Gwendolen could cry. "His father was chosen for me," she continued, "an arranged marriage like the ones I have been trying to force upon my son. I was told it was my duty, and I believed it. I married a man I did not love, bore him children, managed his household, played the part of the perfect duchess. And when he died, I felt." She stopped, swallowed. I felt nothing. Not grief, not relief, just an emptiness where something should have been. I did not know what to say, so I remained silent. "I thought I was doing what was best for Crispin," she said. "I thought if he married for duty, as I did, he would be safe, protected from the kind of pain he experienced when Philippa died. But I see now that I was only trying to protect myself, trying to make his life mirror my own, so that I would not have to face the truth of what I had lost, of what I had never had." She rose from her chair and walked to the window, her back to me, her silhouette framed against the pale winter light. When Crispin told me he loved you, she said, I saw something in his eyes that I had not seen since before Philippa died. Life, hope, joy. She turned to face me. You gave him that. A servant girl with no fortune and no family and no prospects. You gave my son something that I, with all my wealth and power and scheming, could never give him. I did not give him anything, I said. He gave me everything. Lady Gwendolen smiled, and for an instant I glimpsed the beautiful young woman she must once have been, before duty and disappointment had hardened her into marble. Perhaps, she said, you gave each other. She returned to her chair and sat down, folding her hands in her lap with the careful composure of a woman who had spent decades controlling her emotions. I cannot give you my blessing, she said. Not publicly, not yet. The scandal would be too great, too immediate. Society would devour you both. But I can give you time. I can postpone the announcement, dismiss the heiresses, find reasons to delay. And if, after a year, my son's feelings for you remain unchanged. She paused. Then perhaps we will revisit this conversation. It was more than I had dared to hope, more than I had any right to expect. Thank you, I whispered. Do not thank me yet, Lady Gwendolen said. There is still the matter of Lady Seraphina, and the other guests, and society at large. There will be obstacles. There will be cruelty. There will be those who will never accept you, no matter how much time passes. I know, I said, and still you would stay. For him, I said again. For as long as he wants me. Lady Gwendolen nodded slowly. Then we understand each other. She rose, and I rose with her. For a moment, we stood facing each other, the Dowager Duchess and the maid who might one day take her place. Then Lady Gwendolen did something that shocked me more than anything else that had happened in this impossible, miraculous morning. She reached out and took my hand. Welcome to the family, Wren Hartley, she said. God help us all. That afternoon, I learned something that would change everything. I was in the library, the room where so much had happened, when Mrs. Pembroke, the housekeeper, found me. Her face was pale, her hands trembling as she clutched a bundle of papers to her chest. Miss Hartley, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. There is something you must see. She pressed the papers into my hands, and I looked down at them with confusion. They were letters, old letters, the paper yellowed with age and the ink faded to a pale brown. I found them, Mrs. Pembroke said, in Lady Philippa's room. I was cleaning, preparing it for storage as Lady Gwendolen requested, and I found a hidden compartment in her writing desk. I should have brought them to her grace, but I read them first, and She broke off, unable to continue. I looked at the letters in my hands. The handwriting was elegant, feminine, slanted to the right, and as I began to read, my blood ran cold. The letters were from Lady Philippa to her sister, written in the months before her death, and they told a story that no one in this house had ever known. She had been frightened of the pregnancy, frightened of the birth, frightened of something else that she could not quite name. The doctor, she wrote, tells me that all is well, but I do not believe him. There is something wrong. I feel it in my body, in my blood. And when I try to speak of it, he dismisses me. He tells me that women are hysterical, that my fears are unfounded. But I know what I feel. I know that something is wrong. And then, in the final letter, dated just 2 days before her death, I have told Gwendolen of my fears, and she has done nothing. She says the doctor knows best, that I must trust his judgment. But I do not trust him. I think she does not want to know. I think she cares only for the heir, not for me. If something happens to me, if I do not survive, please tell Crispin that I loved him. Tell him that I am sorry. I stared at the words until they blurred before my eyes. Lady Gwendolen had known. She had known that Philippa was afraid, that something was wrong, and she had done nothing. She had prioritized the heir over the mother, and Lady Philippa had died because of it. "What do I do?" Mrs. Pembroke asked, her voice shaking. "Do I tell His Grace? Do I tell the Dowager?" I thought of Crispin, who had spent 5 years blaming himself for his wife's death. I thought of the baby shoe he still carried, the grief that had consumed him. I thought of Lady Gwendolen, who had just offered me a chance at happiness, who had seemed, for the first time, like a human being capable of growth and change. And I thought of Lady Philippa, who had known she was dying and had been ignored. "Leave them with me," I said. "I will decide what to do." Mrs. Pembroke nodded, relief flooding her face, and left me alone with the terrible truth. I did not know, until that moment, how heavy a secret could be. The Christmas ball that evening was the grandest I had ever seen. The great hall of Thornhaven had been transformed into a wonderland of candlelight and crystal, with garlands of holly and ivy festooning every surface, and a string quartet playing in the corner. Hundreds of candles flickered in chandeliers overhead, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The scent of pine and cinnamon filled the air, mingling with the perfumes of the guests and the distant aroma of roasting meats from the kitchen. The heiresses had outdone themselves, each gown more elaborate than the last, each jewel more brilliant, each smile more desperate. They did not know yet that the competition was over. They did not know that the prize they had been vying for had already chosen. I stood in the shadows at the edge of the room, wearing a borrowed gown of deep green velvet that Lady Gwendolen had produced from somewhere in the depths of her wardrobe. It had belonged to her in her youth, she told me, and had not been worn in 30 years. It fit as if it had been made for me, hugging my waist and flowing to the floor in a river of emerald silk. I felt like an imposter, like a child playing dress-up, like a fairy tale heroine who had wandered into the wrong story. But when Crispin's eyes found mine across the crowded room, I saw nothing but love. He moved through the crowd, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries, every inch the Duke of Ravensford. The heiresses flocked to him like moths to a flame. Lady Clarissa in her ivory silk, Lady Honoria in her daring red, Lady Seraphina in her icy blue, each convinced that tonight would be her triumph. They did not know what I knew. They did not know what was coming. At precisely 9 o'clock, Crispin signaled to the musicians, and the music fell silent. The guests turned to face him, champagne glasses in hand, anticipation crackling through the air like electricity before a storm. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying easily through the hall, "I thank you all for joining me this Christmas Eve. It has been a season of celebration and reflection, and I am grateful for your company." The heiresses preened. Lady Clarissa stepped forward, already positioning herself for the moment when he would call her name. "As many of you know," Crispin continued, "my mother has been eager to see me married. She has gathered here 7 of the finest young ladies in England, each accomplished, each beautiful, each worthy of the title of Duchess." I saw the heiresses exchange glances, heard the rustle of silks and the whisper of excited murmurs. This was the moment they had been waiting for. This was their victory. "But I have learned something these past weeks," Crispin said, and his voice softened. "I have learned that titles and fortunes mean nothing without love. I have learned that the heart does not care for bloodlines or dowries or social expectations. I have learned that the woman I want beside me for the rest of my life is not the woman society would choose for me." He turned, and his eyes found mine across the crowded room. "She is the woman my heart chose for itself." The silence was absolute. Every eye followed his gaze to where I stood in the shadows, and I felt the weight of their judgment like a physical thing. I saw shock on Lady Clarissa's face, fury on Lady Seraphina's, confusion on Lady Imogen's. I saw Mrs. Fairchild clutching her daughter's arm as if to prevent her from fainting. I saw Lady Gwendolen standing apart from the crowd, her expression unreadable. Crispin walked toward me, and the crowd parted before him like the Red Sea before Moses. He stopped in front of me, and then, to gasps of shock and disbelief, he lowered himself to one knee. "Wren Hartley," he said, and his voice trembled with emotion. "I have known you only a few weeks, but in that time you have given me more hope, more joy, more reason to live than I have felt in 5 long years. You are not a duchess. You are not an heiress. You are something far more precious. You are the woman I love." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. When he opened it, the gasp that swept through the room was audible. Inside lay a ring, a massive diamond surrounded by sapphires, catching the candlelight and throwing rainbows across the walls. "This ring belonged to my great-grandmother," he said. "It has been passed down through generations of Ashworth duchesses. It is worth £50,000, but its true value lies in what it represents: love, commitment, a promise that endures." He held the ring out to me, and I saw tears glistening in his eyes. "Wren Hartley, will you marry me?" I heard the scandalized whispers. I saw the fury on Lady Seraphina's face, the shock on Lady Clarissa's, the disbelief on everyone's. I knew that what was happening was impossible, unthinkable, a violation of every rule that governed their world, and I did not care. "Yes," I whispered, and then louder, so that everyone could hear. "Yes." He slipped the ring onto my finger, and it fit as if it had been made for me. Then he rose and kissed me, right there in front of God and society and 7 heiresses who had come to claim him for themselves. The room erupted into chaos. I heard shouts and exclamations, saw Lady Seraphina flee in tears, watched Lady Clarissa turn pale and grip her mother's arm for support. Mrs. Fairchild was fanning Lady Imogen with a handkerchief. Lady Honoria was laughing, though whether from amusement or hysteria, I could not tell. Lady Octavia stood apart from the others, her expression thoughtful rather than outraged, and Lady Gwendolen stepped forward. The room fell silent as she approached us, her black gown rustling against the marble floor. For a moment, I thought she would denounce us, would rescind her morning's offer, would destroy everything we had built. But instead, she reached out and took both our hands in hers. "It seems," she said, her voice carrying through the silent hall, "that my son has made his choice. And while it is not the choice I would have made for him, I have learned." She glanced at me, and I saw something like respect in her eyes, that sometimes the heart knows better than the head. "Ladies," she turned to address the heiresses, "I thank you for your interest in my son, but as you can see, his affections are engaged elsewhere. Your carriages will be ready in the morning." The heiresses gaped at her. The guests murmured among themselves, and Crispin squeezed my hand so tightly I thought my bones might break. "One more thing," Lady Gwendolen said, and her voice hardened. "Lady Seraphina." Lady Seraphina, who had been making her way toward the door, stopped and turned. "You threatened Miss Hartley," Lady Gwendolen continued. "You attempted to blackmail her into leaving this house. Did you think I would not find out?" Lady Seraphina's face went white. "Your Grace, I will not tolerate such behavior under my roof," Lady Gwendolen said coldly. "You will leave Thornhaven tonight, and you will not speak of what you have seen here to anyone. If I hear even a whisper of scandal attached to Miss Hartley's name, I will make certain that you never marry, that your family never recovers from the disgrace. Do I make myself clear?" Lady Seraphina nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line, and fled the room without another word. Lady Gwendolen turned back to me, and for the first time since I had known her, she smiled. "Well," she said, "I suppose I had better start planning a wedding." But there was one more thing I had to do before the night was over. After the ball had ended and the guests had retired, after Crispin had kissed me good night and promised to see me in the morning, I went to find Lady Gwendolen. She was in her private sitting room, the same room where we had spoken that morning. She looked tired but not unhappy, and she gestured for me to sit when I entered. "I thought you might come," she said. There is something troubling you." I reached into my pocket and withdrew the letters. Lady Gwendolyn's face went pale as she recognized them. She did not speak as I placed them on the table between us, did not ask where I had found them or how. She simply stared at them as if they were a snake that might strike at any moment. "I read them," I said. "All of them." The silence stretched between us, heavy and painful. "I knew," Lady Gwendolyn said at last, her voice barely above a whisper. "I knew she was afraid. I knew something was wrong. But the doctor assured me that everything was fine, and I wanted so badly to believe him. I wanted the air. I wanted the security of the line continuing, and so I ignored her fears, and she died." She looked up at me, and I saw that she was crying. Not the controlled tears of a woman accustomed to keeping her emotions in check, but the raw, ugly tears of someone whose heart was breaking. "I have carried that guilt for 5 years," she said. "I have watched my son destroy himself with grief, knowing that I could have prevented it. Knowing that if I had listened to Philippa, if I had insisted on a different doctor, if I had put her welfare above my own desires, she might still be alive." "Does Crispin know?" I asked. "No." She shook her head. "I could not bear to tell him. He loved her so much. He would never forgive me." I thought of the letters in front of me, of the power they held. I could destroy Lady Gwendolyn with them. I could turn Crispin against her forever, could banish her from our lives, could exact revenge for all the years she had made the servants' lives miserable. But I thought also of the woman who had taken my hand that morning and welcomed me into her family. I thought of the grief in her eyes, the guilt she had carried for half a decade. I thought of the courage it had taken her to stand up before the entire ballroom and support our engagement. And I made my choice. I picked up the letters and walked to the fireplace. Lady Gwendolyn watched in stunned silence as I fed them to the flames, one by one, until nothing remained but ash. "The past is past," I said. "We cannot change it, but we can choose what happens next." Lady Gwendolyn stared at me as if she had never seen me before. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you protect me?" I met her gaze steadily. "Because Crispin loves you, despite everything. Because the truth would only cause more pain. And because I believe that people can change. That guilt can become grace, if we let it." Lady Gwendolyn rose from her chair and crossed to where I stood. For a moment, we simply looked at each other, the Dowager Duchess and the servant girl who would become her daughter-in-law. And then she did something I never expected. She embraced me. "Thank you," she whispered against my hair. "Thank you." And I held her as she wept, as the fire crackled beside us, as the long night of secrets finally gave way to dawn. We were married in the spring, when the gardens of Thornhaven were alive with roses and the air was soft with the promise of warmer days. It was a small ceremony, attended only by family and a few close friends, but it was everything I had ever dreamed and more. I wore a gown of white silk, simple and elegant, with my mother's sewing needle tucked into the hem for luck. Lady Gwendolyn had offered me jewels from the family vault, but I refused them all except for one, a simple pearl necklace that had belonged to Lady Philippa. Crispin had given it to me the night before the wedding, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "She would have liked you," he said. "I know she would have." I hoped he was right. I hoped that somewhere Lady Philippa was at peace, that she had found her way to the place where the dead go and was watching over us with the same gentle kindness that everyone who had known her remembered. The scandal was immense, of course. For months, we were the subject of gossip in every drawing room from London to Edinburgh. The Duke who married his maid, the servant who stole a fortune. The heiresses who were passed over for a nobody. The newspapers printed caricatures of us. The satirists wrote biting verses. The arbiters of society declared that we would never be received in polite company. But we did not care. We had each other, and that was enough. Lady Seraphina spread vicious rumors about me, claiming I had seduced Crispin with dark arts, that I was carrying his illegitimate child, that I had blackmailed him into marriage. None of it was true, and in time, as scandals do, it faded from the collective memory of society. People grew bored of our story, moved on to newer outrages, forgot that we had ever been controversial at all. Lady Clarissa married a baron the following year, a match that everyone agreed was beneath her, but that she seemed genuinely happy with. I saw her once, years later, at a ball in London. She smiled at me and nodded, and there was no resentment in her eyes, only something that might have been respect. Lady Honoria caught the eye of an American industrialist and sailed off to New York, where she scandalized Fifth Avenue with her daring gowns and her wicked laugh. Lady Imogen finally escaped her mother's control and found peace in a quiet life in the country, married to a curate who loved her poetry and did not care about her fortune. Lady Octavia married well and became a patroness of the arts, her early widowhood forgotten in the glow of her later success, and I became the Duchess of Ravensford. It was not easy, nothing worth having ever is. There were those who never accepted me, who snubbed me at parties and whispered behind my back and refused to acknowledge my existence. There were days when the weight of expectation felt crushing, when I wondered if I had made a terrible mistake, if I should have walked away when I had the chance. But then Crispin would take my hand, or smile at me across the dinner table, or read poetry to me by the fire, and I would remember why I had chosen this life. I would remember that love is not about perfection or ease or the approval of others. Love is about choosing someone again and again, through the hard times and the good times, through scandal and sorrow and joy. Lady Gwendolen softened in the years that followed, particularly after the birth of our first child, a boy we named Edward after Crispin's father. She held her grandson in her arms and wept, and I saw in her eyes the love she had never been able to express, the tenderness she had buried beneath decades of duty and disappointment. She became, in time, something I never expected. A friend, a confidant, a grandmother who doted on her grandchildren with a ferocity that surprised everyone who had known her before. She is gone now, passed peacefully in her sleep on a winter morning 3 years ago. I miss her more than I expected to. She taught me what it meant to be a duchess, yes, but she also taught me what it meant to be strong, to endure, to fight for what matters, even when the world tells you it is impossible. I sit now in the library where it all began, the library where a grieving duke and a lonely maid found each other in the darkness. The fire crackles in the grate, and outside the window, snow falls softly on Thornhaven Hall, covering the world in white. Crispin is reading in the chair beside me, his hair silver now at the temples, his face lined with laughter and life. Edward is at Cambridge, studying literature like his father before him, dreaming of being a poet. Our daughter, Philippa, named for the wife Crispin lost so long ago, is upstairs practicing her pianoforte. Our youngest, a boy named William, is asleep in the nursery, watched over by a nurse who loves him as if he were her own. We have been married for 25 years, and every day I am grateful. Sometimes, on quiet evenings like this one, Crispin will reach into his pocket and show me the baby shoe he still carries. He does not need to explain. I understand. The grief never truly leaves us. It simply becomes part of who we are, woven into the fabric of our lives like a thread of darker color running through a tapestry. We honor those we have lost, not by forgetting them, but by carrying them with us, by letting their memory shape the people we become. I think often of my mother, whose sewing needle I still keep in a velvet box on my dressing table. I think of Lady Philippa, whose portrait hangs in the gallery alongside mine now, 2 duchesses separated by tragedy, but united by love for the same man. I think of Lady Gwendolen, who taught me that even the hardest hearts can learn to bend, that redemption is always possible for those who seek it. And I think of all the invisible women, the servants and maids and seamstresses and cooks who labor in the shadows of great houses, whose dreams are dismissed and whose voices go unheard. I have not forgotten where I came from. I never will. The charity I have founded in my mother's name provides education and opportunity for young women in service, gives them the tools to build lives of their own choosing rather than the lives circumstance has assigned them. It is not much. It cannot change the world, but it can change individual lives, and that, I have learned, is how all lasting change begins. Not for the title or the fortune or the great house that I now call home. I am grateful for him, for the man who saw me when I was invisible, for the love that defied every expectation, for the life we built together, stone by stone, through scandal and redemption, through loss and joy, through all the seasons of a long and imperfect and beautiful marriage. I think sometimes of the girl I used to be, the maid who crept into the library after dark to steal moments with books and dreams. I think of how impossible it would have seemed to her, this life, this love, this extraordinary, ordinary happiness. She would not have believed it. She would have thought it was a fairy tale, and she knew, as all girls who grow up poor and invisible know, that fairy tales are for other people. But she was wrong, and I am glad of it. I was nobody the night he chose me. But I am somebody now. I am Wren Ashworth, Duchess of Ravensford, and this is my story.